NightMerica is an independently produced podcast. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/NightMerica. And please tell your friends about us.
Welcome to NightMerica, a podcast that takes you on a tour of the abnormal, paranormal, weirdly true, and truly weird in every corner across this nation. Because, to paraphrase Ray Parker Jr., whether it's ghosts, aliens, monsters, or monstrous humans, there's something strange in your neighborhoods. Episode 28, An American Vampire. It's not really a super catchy title. Maybe it'd be like, Vampires Don't Suck. But that's kind of on the nose.
It's kind of on the nose, and my vampire really sucks as a human.
And, well, my vampire story sucks for other reasons. But, okay, so vampires suck. We'll just go the other direction.
Yeah.
People should probably know who we are. If this is their first time listening to this podcast, because they want to tune in to learn about true crime and paranormal and sometimes paranormal-themed true crime, I'm Aaron Sagers, and I'm from Paranormal Caught on Camera and Paranormal Pop Culture, and as always, joined by my awesome co-host, Britt.
Hey, guys.
Britt.
I'm Britt. Thanks for listening in for however you found us. Let us know however you found us, but welcome.
And if this is your first time, I think that we're going to get into the larger topic of the news and everything, but this is it's Halloween season as we're recording this. Makes me a little sad because I'm a big summer fan, child of summer. Love the summer. But Labor Day has passed and now we're officially in the spooky season.
Spooky season. This is my season. I have a pot of chili bubbling on the stove right this second. I got a new pack of incense. I'm wearing a sweater. This is my time to be alive. I am a fall girl.
You are a fall girl. I am not a fall guy, except for the 80s TV series Fall Guy starring Lee Majors about a stuntman who is also a bounty hunter. I wish I was that kind of fall guy. But, I like autumn. I can get into the autumnal
I'm surprised
spirit.
You're not... I know that you're a tiki person, but I'm surprised you're not more into it being that your birthday is in November.
I do like the fall. I do like autumn. I'm just more of a child of summer. Mm-hmm. But since they are next to each other, I always go tiki. I always go summer. But I can merge those two loves together a little bit in the September, October, November time. And yeah, it's a good time to eat some chili, make some pumpkin pie.
Are there pumpkin tiki drinks? Can we record in person at some point and have pumpkin tiki drinks?
I will have to explore that because I think it could quickly get a little bit nasty. But you could do some cider with rum.
That would be good.
And there are Halloween tiki drinks where you can use some charcoal to create a nice dark color, and you can use some bubbly drinks, like a dry ice. There are a lot of Halloween-themed tiki drinks. Pumpkin, I would have to explore a little bit more, but yeah, I'll do some homework on that.
That'd be fun.
But yeah, so we're going to be really kind of leaning heavily into the autumnal Halloween-y vibe over these next couple episodes, which even means breaking the formula a little bit. We've been doing this long enough. 28 episodes. We can make our own rules. We can break the rules. And so normally we do destination-based topics. Yep. And we're going a little bit bigger, a little bit broader this time. We're doing themes. Yeah. So,
is your vampire in America, or are you really breaking the rules?
No. It's NightMerica. I'm keeping it in America. Although I've mentioned the story before, or in this podcast before, that I have spent a lot of time in Romania.
I know, that's why I asked. Can we do that for our mini-sode this week?
And we could talk about my travels in Romania. I didn't actually encounter a vampire in Romania.
That you know of.
that I know of. But I mean, I certainly I had some spooky experiences over there. But well, before we get too deep into the topic, let's talk a little bit about some news stories from the world of the weird this week. I hope we don't have the same news story. We should have compared
We
notes.
definitely don't.
Oh, okay. Well, what's your story?
So, my story is that at the beginning of the month, a federal bomb squad was sent to Berlin to investigate a styrofoam box that was abandoned on a train in Heidelberg. The ominous, lonely box had 3 vials of liquid in it and set quite an alarm to those around it because of what's been going on in the world right now. Forensic specialists were deployed, investigated the fluid to find it was, what are you going to guess?
Pee.
Genetic material from hamsters.
That was going to be my next guess. I always go straight to pee, and then after pee, it's hamster.
I love hamsters. I love that bomb squads and forensic specialists were all brought in because they thought this was some weapon of war, and then it turns out to just be DNA from a hammy.
To be fair, you don't know that it's not a weapon of war. Somebody could be trying to create mutant, weaponized hamsters as their minions.
Oh, let me tell you. I grew up with hamsters. I grew up in apartments. I am a hamster girl. I have had 3. I am desperate for another one, but I live in a studio apartment and they're nocturnal. But one of my hamsters was absolutely a weapon of war. She bit everybody. She was just a little monster. And at one point she got stuck in her cage behind her wheel, and it was 127 hours. Her arm was stuck. She wouldn't let any of us help her because she was biting. She was panicked. And she ate off her own arm. And then the little paw fell to the cage. And I immediately rushed to, change the thing so, we could clean it and get it out. And she ate her paw.
Wow.
Oh,
That's
my God.
gruesome.
It's so gruesome. But when I saw this, I immediately thought of that horrible hamster and had to share this.
Did she survive?
Yeah, she survived. She went on to live for another year, and then we moved out of the country, and I gave her to someone else. So,
wow.
I know.
Well, I what was her name?
It's not very woke, so I don't want to say it.
Okay, so
she was a dwarf hamster.
Oh gosh, so Britt has some sort of troubling past. Let's look. We're still in the early phases of this podcast. We don't want to get canceled.
Delicately avoiding you asking that question.
This is why we need to compare notes beforehand, yes. Britt. So you're by the way, it's a insensitive name. Don't ask me on air or while recording, Aaron. But this is a learning process.
This is a learning process. Who knew we should talk about what we're doing before we do it?
Well, look, I'm sure we've all made some mistakes in our past, and anyhow, lest people start speculating what the name of this hamster is, I will say that your hamster does sound pretty badass, and sounds like the kind of hamster that if people were going to create an army of human hamster hybrids as these weaponized hamsters of war, then sounds like your insensitively named hamster could be the good DNA basis, good genetic basis for it.
She totally would be.
And we would give her a better name.
We can call her Midge.
Yeah, I think you're paving the way of where this is going. So, wait, is that the rest of your story? Is there more to it?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, okay. Well, there's nothing controversial about Venus, except that it rhymes with penis, but we can say penis on there. I mean, why not?
We can say penis, but we can't say my hamster's name.
Nope. But this is the thing, is so Mars, for years, has been receiving all the attention. Gotta go to Mars. Gonna be life on Mars. But I'll tell you what, Mars, Venus might be the place to be, and it might be the place where microbial life is. Now, this comes from NPR, but this was all over the place, and this is news that is breaking right now, in fact, scientists say they have detected a gas in the clouds of Venus that perhaps is produced by microbial life. Researchers have been racking their brains trying to understand what this toxic gas, phosphine, is there in such quantities, why it's there in such quantities. The mystery raises the astonishing possibility that Venus, the planet that comes closest to Earth as it whizzes around the sun, might have some kind of life flourishing 30 miles up in its yellow, hazy clouds. Now, nothing on the surface of Venus could live there. Well, based on our definition of life, it's really these volcanic plains. It's considered a scorching hellscape, hot enough to melt lead. Temperatures exceed 800 degrees Fahrenheit. However, high in the clouds, things are a little bit less intense. And back in the day, though, Venus was pretty similar to Earth, and the surface was actually pretty habitable before it had its own greenhouse effect that set in. And Carl Sagan, loved Carl Sagan, even entertained the notion back in the 1960s that life could have inhabited the surface of Venus. Now, all of that said, I just feel like, yeah, Mars is still pretty cool, but if there is perhaps microbial life in the clouds of Venus that is producing this phosphine gas, that kind of gives Venus a little bit of heads up. And it reminds me of the Twilight Zone episode of Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up? I don't know if you've heard of this one. You probably heard of this one. But it's basically where this bus full of passengers end up at a diner, and then these highway patrolmen come in and suspect that one of them is an alien and one of them is from Mars. And at the end of the episode, spoiler alert, basically everybody on the bus dies. But a guy walks back in the diner and is talking to the diner owner. And the guy that walks back in the diner, he was one of the occupants on the bus. And he's like, ha, 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 by the way, Martians are already here, and I'm the Martian. And he pulls out an extra arm. He's got a third arm, and he lights a cigarette. And then the cafe owner takes off his hat, and he has a third eye. And he's like, suck it, Mars, because the Venusians have been here long before y'all, so we've already colonized Earth. So step up.
Wow. Is this a word-for-word play-by-play?
Yes, actually, in the 1960s when Twilight Zone was on, step off was part of the vernacular. And, you know, I think that is, yeah, it's like I'm reading from the script
It
right
is.
now.
We actually got the approval to just play a clip of the actual show. That's what you guys just heard.
Yeah, so there you go. And, yeah, it's vernacular from the late 50s to early 60s. But, so, okay, you know, maybe there's life on Venus. I don't know. Every day it does seem like there's new news coming out that something's going on, and we don't know exactly what it is. So, I say bring it on. Anyhow, shall we talk some more about the topic today?
Let's get into it. This was a lot to research.
Before we get into it, your background with vampires. What? I mean, because you spent so much time in Paris, there's some cool vampire lore associated with that city.
Yeah, I don't know too much about it, but my mom, growing up, really loved the Interview with a Vampire series, and so she had me read that, and so, like, Lestat was probably, like, the first vampire that I was, like, introduced to. And then, guys, I am so sorry, but I was really into Twilight, so...
There's nothing wrong with that. I personally do not care for it, but I don't judge anyone's pop culture
I was
affinity.
Team Edward all the way. I am not Team Jacob. I'm sorry.
Right. I think I would be... I don't know. I don't know. I go back and forth with vampires versus werewolves. Although, in a lot of lore, they were kind of one and the same. Mm-hmm. That a vampire could turn into a wolf. So, that, you know, the vampire versus werewolves thing didn't really come along until a lot later. In fact, a lot of lore that we associate with vampires was established much, much, much later, and a lot of it was influenced by pop culture instead of actual.
Oh.
Yeah, like even just the idea of how you become a vampire was not so much through a vampire's bite, but you could be living a life of sin or promiscuous
Mm.
or causing some sort of offense to God, and that's how, or maybe dying without being baptized and coming back as a vampire. So it wasn't
Oh.
about, and the idea of like vampires not being able to walk around during the day,
Mm-hmm.
that was introduced in Nosferatu, I believe.
Oh.
So that all of that stuff is much later in the early 20th century. So, but for you personally, but do you think you could handle immortality?
No. I mean, I just think I would get bored. Like being in quarantine, and I was furloughed from my job for like 3 months. And it would be like month 3, I would just look around like, okay, now what do I do? Like
Oh,
I
not me.
realized, what?
Not me.
Oh, okay.
No, go on. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, no, I would get bored, like not going anywhere, not doing anything. I mean, I guess if you had eternal life, like you couldn't probably get COVID, so you could do whatever the fuck you wanted. But
I think that, yeah, if you were a vampire in quarantine, it would probably suck. But if you're a vampire and you're able to travel, go anywhere, if you
okay,
do
well
it
then that
right,
I'm down with it.
you do have to deal with watching all of your loved ones die and then
Yeah.
maybe making new loved ones and then watching them die and
Yeah.
over again.
I
I
don't
don't
know
think I can
though.
do that. I'm okay with that.
Researching this story and like reading about people drinking human blood, I got so sick.
Well, so interestingly enough, so New Orleans is a big vampire town
Mhm.
associated with vampire lore. And New York as well actually has a lot of vampire contingents. But I do know some vampires in New Orleans. And the way and they do believe that drinking human blood provides them with a sustenance of sorts. They still eat regular food, but consuming blood provides them with a vitality. And there is one vampire friend of mine in particular that has multiple donors, and it's a voluntary system, and it's a very safe and clean system, and it sometimes involves, now there some vampires have sort of a, they take vials of blood, but in this case he takes it right from the source. There is a process of safe cutting, and then he sucks the blood from his donors directly. And Britt says nothing.
It's interesting because I can talk about 30-year-old brunette women in the Upper West Side getting brutally murdered, and it doesn't bug me at all. Like, I can read about things that happen exactly to me, doesn't make my stomach turn. But for some reason, the idea of ingesting blood, I'm fine with like seeing blood. I'm fine with getting cut. It doesn't like give me the heebie-jeebies. But for some reason, this story made me feel so sick.
Do you? So you can watch your own blood, but you
Yeah.
like when you prick your finger, you don't just suck the blood off the tip.
Ew, no.
You've never tasted your own blood.
I mean, sure, I'm sure I have, but like, wash your hands and like put a
Does it
band-aid on it.
does it taste good? Your own blood?
No, no. It's
Really?
gross. You stop being a creep. Is this were you actually the vampire friend?
I was actually the vampire friend. No, but I did have a lot of time. In fact, I think last year at a Comic-Con in New Orleans, I had a vampire panel where I had real vampires on it, and we talked a lot about this. I will say, I don't know what if it's still being published, but there was a book called The Dead Travel Fast, which was an exploration of vampire culture from several years ago, and the author starts the book by talking about drinking his own blood, and he gets quite sick from it because
Yeah.
he's not equipped to do it. Okay, before we get into your story, I'm excited to get your story. Let's hear from a sponsor. Think things are bad now? Well, it could be worse. Don't believe me? Just read Dead Run, the new sci-fi thriller from author Mike Maddox. A mysterious force is taking control of people's bodies and making them run to stay alive. And if you can't keep running, now this is the ad copy, so I'm reading the ad copy because it says, if you can't keep running, you blow up like spaghetti left in the microwave too long. It's not a good scene. It's a very messy situation.
And it's got to have marinara sauce because then it kind of looks like blood.
Right. And the pasta itself would be sort of look like viscera.
Ew.
And except in a microwave, but at least in a microwave, you're contained. The explosion is contained. Yeah. It's a messy microwave to clean up. But if you're running down the road and you can't run anymore, just splat. And then you're all over your friends and the other apocalyptic pals.
Ew, do not nearby. Splat on me.
And in an apocalypse, you don't have easy access to soap, water. I don't even know if you can stop running long enough to like shampoo and bathe after your friend, your pal is just blown up on you. Anyhow, I mean, this is really, I think, selling the book. Anyhow, the story follows a group of weary travelers as they make their way through a hellish landscape where there's only one rule: run or die. This is Dead Run. And other than being chilling and scary, it will also perhaps inspire you to eat the right kind of carbs and jog every day just in case this apocalypse hits. So check it out. It's available exclusively on Amazon Kindle. It's only like $3. It's well worth your $3. And read Dead Run by Mike Maddox on Amazon Kindle. And we're back, and Britt is ready to gross us all out with her vampire story.
Yep.
Let's hear it.
Let's buckle up for this very dark tale of Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento. I heard about him like a long time ago and remember like hearing bits and pieces and just being flabbergasted. So this is the full juicy tale. I don't know why that word just came to my head. I think because it's a great pun. That's why it came to your head. I'm so proud of you. It's so gross. Richard was born May 23rd, 1950 in Sacramento into a super rough world right off the bat. His dad was physically abusive, and very quickly he showed the McDonald triad of sociopathy, which is bedwetting, setting fires, and harm to animals. So, rough start. Being too much to manage, his dad actually kicked him out of the house, and he began experimenting with drugs, mainly LSD and alcohol. It's a dangerous combination if you really struggle with mental illness. This experimentation led him to disturbing beliefs about himself. One being was that he was near death and not getting enough vitamin C. So what he would do to fix this is that he would push orange peels into his forehead, like really hard, hoping that the orange peels would like diffuse through his skin. Now I grew up in a very alternative medicine household, but even this is a little alternative to me. I don't know. Based on some beliefs that people have these days, it kind of makes sense. I mean, we can't even get people to wear masks. So True. If only it sounds. Damn it! I missed a chance for a terrible pun. What's the pun? Okay, I'll give it to you anyhow. Set it up one more time. What would he do, Britt? He would push oranges into his forehead. I've heard of an orange crush, but that's ridiculous. Yeah. We did it. Thanks for the assist. Always. If only this weirdness stopped with oranges. But of course, oranges don't get you on a true crime podcast. In 1975, he was institutionalized because he believed he needed blood to keep his heart pumping. So he injected himself with the blood of a rabbit, and it made him violently sick, and he had to be hospitalized. While he was in the hospital, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was now on supervised medication. He didn't like it. He thought it was making him more sick, so he turned to killing birds out of the windows of the hospital and drinking their blood to make him better. So everyone in the hospital started calling him Dracula. What's unfortunate is that he somehow was convincing them that he was getting better. So he was allowed to be released from the hospital into the care of his mom. But she was being strict about his medication and care, and he felt like she was still poisoning him. So he moved in with some friends. I'm using air quotes because I'm guessing they were strangers, because who would willingly move in with this dude? But they got freaked out by his behaviors. They said he would walk around naked all of the time. They moved out, and they left him in the apartment alone to his own devices. So this is when it starts getting real bad. He started going back to killing and drinking the blood of animals. He started mixing the blood with Coca-Cola to make it more palatable.
Well, just, a little... I mean, I add lime to a lot of drinks, so...
I mean, I was really into Coke Black. Do you remember Coke Black?
I do, and I think we might be the only two.
With a shot of espresso. I was so into it. It was so good.
It's gone too soon. Yes, I agree.
But Coke with blood is disgusting.
Terrible branding.
Terrible
marketing
branding.
Plan. Yeah.
2 years.
Sorry, go on.
No, say it.
Sorry. No, it's just there's like Coke Zero, but Coke Coke O negative or whatever. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Coke is never going to advertise on our podcast now. But we'll take Pepsi. So 2 years after his release, he was found in Lake Tahoe, covered in blood with a liver in the bucket of his trunk. But the police somehow determined, just with their eyeballs, that it was the blood of a cow, so they let him go. I don't know how they were able to determine that, just without any evidence collection, but whatever. Also, I'll post pictures to our Instagram. This guy's face was like so creepy. I don't know how a man that looked like that covered in blood could get away with it, but whatever. He was white, so let's be honest, that probably had something to do with it. And now that he has the confidence that as a white man he can get away with these brutal crimes, he starts to escalate. In December, just a couple months after the Tahoe incident, his mom tells him that he's not invited to come to Christmas because he's a creep. That's my words, not hers. He gets angry and while driving home, shoots a 51-year-old man who is just helping his wife bring in the groceries.
Yeah, that sucks.
And he just shot him and drove away. That's just gross, but he got away with it, so he started to get really cocky. In 1978, and this is probably what most people know him for, he starts checking doors in different neighborhoods to see if they are locked. So this is why it's important to lock your doors. If he found one that was left open, he would say it was a sign for him to go in. So he finds the house of pregnant Teresa Wallen open. He lets himself in. And if the story so far hasn't been up of a trigger warning, I'm just going to say trigger warning. She is shot 3 times. He then cuts out her organs and drinks her blood using a yogurt cup that was left on the counter. Obviously, she didn't survive, and neither did her child. 4 days later, he finds Evelyn Miroth's door unlocked. Inside was Evelyn, her son, and her friend David. When the police come in, they find David and her son shot in his room. And Evelyn is laying, again, trigger warning, with her stomach cut open, her organs missing, and evidence that she had been sodomized after death. It turns out in the trial that someone had knocked on the door and scared him. So he took Evelyn's car keys, stole her car, and fled the scene. If you want to do some more research, I didn't want to cover this on the podcast, but there was a baby in the house as well. And when he fled, he took the child. It's really horrible. The neighbor, of course, calls 911, and Richard had left his fingerprints all over the scene. So the police get there, they immediately connect the dots, and they go to his apartment to search. In his apartment, they find a blender covered in blood, blood-stained utensils, and a brain in the fridge. So, not only is everything covered in blood, and he's gross because he drinks blood, he's not clean.
Well, I would say that in a very disturbing, gruesome story, his cleanliness is close to godliness, is the old saying, and this is clearly not the case with him. So
no. He's immediately arrested. His trial took 5 months. His attorney claimed not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours and convicted him on 6 counts of murder to be sentenced by death in the gas chamber. His fellow inmates were terrified of him and would, be really cruel to him in jail. And he actually ended up committing suicide before he could be put to death by stockpiling his anti-anxiety medication and overdosing the day after Christmas in 1980. And that is the story of Richard Chase.
Yeah, and definitely a disturbing one. There's, and we've talked a little bit about this, there are actually multiple vampire killers in America alone, and the ones that I find, I'm not going to tell each of their stories because it's easy enough to look them up, but varying degrees of belief in sort of vampire lore, believing that there was one, the vampire slasher of San Francisco, that believed he was a 2,000-year-old vampire, and then others that believed that they were being sustained by consuming human blood. What I think is what's interesting about Chase is that the notion of the open door, the unlocked door, there's a classic idea within vampire lore as well as demonology and the paranormal that you have to be invited in. That as an entity, if you hear 3 knocks on the door and you open that door, that's you being invited in. So kind of by extension, perhaps he was thinking that by it being unlocked, that's an invitation. That's literally the door being left open for him. Backtracking, is there theories that there were victims that were never identified?
Yes.
Of his?
I think there's got to be, especially when he was seen in Lake Tahoe covered in blood. I think that has to be a human that he went after, that it was just never solved. It's got to be a cold case in that area, and no one's been able to directly connect the dots to him. Yeah,
it's a disturbing one. I mean, I think, as we've spoken a little bit off the air, this is obviously paranormal and true crime podcast, but it's always difficult managing that line about how much to talk about. Obviously, these things did happen, but man, some of it just gets so dark that
it's so dark. Take your medication, seek help, take care of yourself.
Yeah. There is kind of a question of, I don't know, maybe this is an unpopular idea about, there's a lot of people, a lot of us out there who struggle with things that are, even in our challenges, are not going so far as necrophilia and drinking blood and cannibalism and everything. So there are a lot of stories about people that don't appear to have a history of this kind of activity, that then, in an attempt to cover up whatever heinous crime they've done, do suddenly start dismembering bodies, and that's like a whole other thing. We could do a whole episode about people that after they've killed someone, they're like, oh, the best thing to do is suddenly start dismembering the body and distributing it elsewhere. There's a couple in New Orleans as well, a couple of cases like that. Well, gruesome. Definitely Richard Chase, the vampire Sacramento. We're going to go a little bit different direction for my story, which we will hear right after another word from our sponsors. Is Brooklyn one of the most haunted places in America? It's a worthwhile question. And this podcast happens to be brought to you in part by Brooklyn's one and only mobile ghost tour, Madame Morbid Trolley Tours, which is the official haunted tour of NightMerica. So, we've talked about this before. Madame Morbid, it's a Victorian-era funeral-inspired trolley, which just sounds like a great way to cruise around town, don't you think?
The only way I want to cruise around town.
The only way. See, you're making a bold claim. You're just planting a flag in only if it's not if it's not Victorian-era funeral-inspired trolley, it's
why bother?
It's crap, according to Brit. Well, then that's why you should go on a Madame Morbid trolley tour. First chance you get, because it is the only way to cruise around Brooklyn and learn about Brooklyn's haunted history and true crime. So they are currently off the road. They are social distancing. They're chasing ghosts, but they also have gift cards available for when they reopen, which hopefully is soon. As we're recording this, hopefully we're getting close to them being able to reopen. So be sure to check out madamemorbid.com or give them a follow at Madame Morbid NYC to support your local ghost tour and our official haunted tour. And by the way, their answer is yes. Brooklyn is haunted. Okay, well, I don't want to say that this is a lighter note story, but it's perhaps not, definitely not murderous and maybe tragic in a different way. But let's think back to 30 years ago, Griswold, Connecticut, 1990. It's a group of children playing near a gravel mine, and they discover graves. In fact, they discover 29 burials that were typical of the kinds of graves you might see in the 1700s and early 1800s. However, burial number 4 that they found was atypical. Connecticut state archaeologist Nick Bellantoni was called in, and he said that this was only one of 2 stone crypts in this farm cemetery that these children had discovered. And inside this one stone crypt, which was painted red, it was a coffin that was painted red, he found the skeletal feet of a man, proceeds to take off the rest of the coffin lid, and then things get a little interesting, because this skeleton of a 50-ish-year-old man was beheaded, and his skull and thigh bones rested atop his ribs and atop his vertebrae, almost like a skull and crossbones or a Jolly Roger, like a Jolly Roger pattern. Analysis showed that this dismemberment of the body occurred nearly 5 years after the occupant's death, and this skeleton came to be known as JB because there were some brass nails hammered into the coffin. So JB. And this, my friends, remains the only intact archaeological clue to what we know as the New England vampire panic. So, the New England vampire panic. Well, let's introduce Michael Bell. He's a Rhode Island folklorist. Michael Bell is really sort of the superstar of vampire folklore and the New England vampire panic in North America, or at least in the United States. Maybe Canada has their own guy. Michael Bell has documented 8 exhumations reaching as far back as the late 1700s and as far west as Minnesota. Most of them, however, are in New England and occurred in the 1800s. Now, consider that this was what's analogous to this, the witch trials of Salem, Massachusetts. That was in the 1690s. Now we're talking about the 1800s, and this vampire panic was taking place. And in fact, the first known reference to a vampire scare in America was this letter to the editor of the Connecticut Current and Weekly Intelligencer in 1784. And there was a councilman named Moses Holmes from the town of Willington who warned people to beware of, quote, a certain quack doctor, a foreigner, who had urged families to dig up and burn dead relatives to stop consumption, or what we know as tuberculosis. And we'll get into that in a minute. Now, these desecrations of dead bodies, dead relatives, these vampire hunts, were quiet affairs a lot of times, but they occasionally became quite public, such as in Manchester, Vermont. There were hundreds of people that flocked to a 1793 heart-burning ceremony where the newspaper quoted, or actually historical records were documented as saying, quote, Timothy Meade officiated at the altar in the sacrifice of the demon vampire who it was believed was still sucking the blood of the then living wife of Captain Burton. Interestingly enough, the early town history also said, it was a month of February and good slaying, which is a great pun, but meaning sleigh riding, slaying, but they also, but they spelled it slaying. Slaying instead of slain, S-L-A-Y-N, yeah. Anyhow, the Rhode Island Monthly reported, and this was a recent report, but in their own research, they wrote of a late 1700s case of a man named Snuffy Tillinghast, which is a great name.
That is a great name.
Snuffy Tillinghast.
It's like Stubby McCockburn.
Like Stubby McCockburn, except Snuffy Tillinghast. So Snuffy dreamt that half of his apple orchard withered, late 1700s. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the symbolism didn't really present itself until later, when, this is Exeter, Rhode Island, the farmers' children were struck by consumption, tuberculosis, I cannot speak today, in quick succession. The eldest child, Sarah, was the first to perish in 1799. However, 5 more children of Snuffy and Sarah's mother also fell ill, and all of them complained that Sarah visited them in death after dark and weighed upon their chests. So the neighbors of Snuffy convinced him to examine his buried children, and the neighbors, the local mob, carried picks and spades and everything to the family plot, cracked open the coffins to find that all of the bodies were in advanced stages of decomposition, except Sarah, who had long fingernails, open eyes, and fresh blood in her heart. So they deduced that she must be a vampire, and she was being nourished by the blood of her siblings. Now, how do you dispatch of a vampire in New England? Well, the old Eastern European lore was cutting off the head, putting a brick in its mouth, maybe putting garlic around, a necklace of garlic around. Also, the idea of staking a vampire was not, again, modern pop culture associates staking, wooden stake, to destroying a vampire. Really, the idea was to stake a vampire was just to keep them in place, so they couldn't get out. And then they would just be wiggling around in their coffin like, I can't move. I'm stuck here. But vampire lore over here is that A vampire slayed by destroying its heart, and then you could burn the heart, which is what happened to Sarah's. Her heart was cut out and burned to an ash. However, one of Sarah's siblings did still die. However, her mom, Honor, survived. Okay, there's some more here. There's a vampire heart torched in Woodstock, Vermont, on the town green in 1830. 1854 in Jewett City, Connecticut, which is actually close to Griswold, where we get the story of J.B., townspeople had exhumed several corpses suspected to be vampires, and they believed that they were rising from their graves to kill the living. The vampire panic of New England was such that even Henry David Thoreau, who was a poet and philosopher, we know him, he wrote about it in a September 26, 1859 journal entry, and he said, quote, "The savage in man is never quite eradicated. I have just read of a family in Vermont who, several of its members having died of consumption, just burned the lungs, heart, and liver of their last deceased in order to prevent any more from having it, having the disease. Communities in Maine and Massachusetts, now they believe that you could stop the vampires by just exhuming them and flipping them over face down in the grave, which seems like pretty simple.
Yeah, that seems very simple.
Yeah. It's easier. It's less mess, less muss, less fuss.
I don't know if I believe it.
But in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont, well, I already mentioned that they would cut out the heart and burn it. However, that wasn't all that they would do, because sometimes they would inhale the smoke of the burning heart as a cure, and sometimes they would actually create a mixture with the ashes and drink that with the burned heart. Yeah.
These people.
Yeah, some of that happened in Europe as well, and they would even bind the feet with thorns to keep them tied down. So let's talk a little bit about tuberculosis. So JB, who is our vampire from the beginning, or accused vampire, he suffered from tuberculosis, modern scientists deduced, or some sort of lung disease. And this wasting illness would often receive the diagnosis of consumption. However, a lot of people said that the notion of vampires, the people that believed in vampirism believed that these vampires were responsible for preying upon family members who then subsequently fell sick. And tuberculosis had started to plague New England in the 1730s, and that was a few decades before that first known vampire scare. By the 1800s, these scares were really at their height. And, think about it. The disease, tuberculosis consumption, was the leading cause of mortality throughout the entire northeast portion of the country. And it claimed a quarter of all deaths during this period. And the symptoms of tuberculosis would often be people that would just be so destroyed by the disease. They would have pale and withered bodies, and they would actually resemble walking corpses, sort of in the similar way that vampires are portrayed in pop culture. And some localities said that victims were, quote, in the vampire's grasp. And of course, they coughed up blood, and that was when the fluid would collect in collapsed lungs. And they couldn't breathe very well because they were, because of all of that incessant hacking, they were starved of oxygen. And they felt as if someone was sitting on their chest, such as the story that we had mentioned earlier of the Tillinghast family. And to other members of the family, it might look like someone was even sucking the blood from their loved ones as they were withering away. So these beliefs, a lot of rural areas of New England at the time, they were very pious people, but they weren't church-going people in the traditional sense at that time. And these legends were likely carried over from maybe Hessian mercenaries in the Revolutionary War or from immigrants from Slavic Europe. And when we also think about what had happened when they would exhume these bodies would be bloated. They would look like they had recently eaten because they had these blood-filled faces.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you do penetrate the body of a corpse, it essentially screams because of the escape of natural gases.
Ah, yeah.
Which I have heard this sound from a corpse. And,
Really?
And it is an odd sound. Yeah, I've been around people who have recently passed, and there is this sound that is emitted. It's unsettling.
Oh my God.
And so all of that leads up to the story of Mercy Brown, who is the last American vampire. And it was a young girl, 19 years old, late 19th century. Mercy Lena Brown, everybody called her Lena. And she lived in the town of Exeter, sort of like the Tillinghast family. And Exeter was a town in decline, really. It had bad soil. It was an agrarian town, but it had bad soil. Civil War casualties really peeled away the population, so the population was dwindling, and other people, the younger folks, because of the railroad system that offered up the potential for a more promising future, were clearing out of there. And tuberculosis was ravaging this area. In fact, this area was known as Deserted Exeter. So in December 1882, Lena's mother, Mercy Brown's mother, Mary Eliza, was the first of the Brown family to go from tuberculosis. Lena's sister, or Mercy's sister, I'm going to use these names interchangeably, Mary Olive, was a 20-year-old dressmaker. She died the next year, so in 1883. Interestingly enough, the obit for Mary Olive was quite sweet and solemn and said a lot of nice things about her, which was not extended to other members of the family later on.
Huh. I wonder what that's all about.
I don't know. I don't know. She was actually church-going, though.
She was like the nice one of the family. Every family
guess
has
so.
one. My nephew is the nice one of the family.
I also think maybe it's to fit a narrative because, so Brother Edwin, also known as Eddie, cleared out. He went to Colorado. He was suffering from tuberculosis, but he went to Colorado believing that the better climate would be helpful for him. But instead, he was sickened, and eventually, after a brief remission, he did return to Exeter and fell ill. At this time, Mercy, unfortunately, was also on her deathbed, and when Mercy Lena Brown passed away, Eddie was still ill. So, the town people came to suspect evil forces. Maybe one of the three Brown women that had died from consumption, maybe they weren't dead at all. And instead they were feasting on the living tissue and blood of Edwin, as the Providence Journal later reported. Now some locals didn't use the term vampire, but the papers most certainly did. And these locals did think, according to this lore that we have built up, that you could exhume the body, you could destroy it if you found the right body that looked like the vampire, and then Edwin would recover. So the neighbors asked George Brown, the father, to exhume the bodies, and he gave permission. And they went about their work of exhuming the bodies to check for fresh blood in the hearts. On the morning of March 17th, 1892, they dug up the bodies, and a family doctor, as well as a correspondent from the Providence Journal, looked on. And Lena, now again, this is in March, this is during winter, so the decomposition process is slowed down. Lena had been dead for a couple months. It was wintertime, and the body was in a fairly well-preserved state. The heart and liver were removed. They cut open the heart, and the blood was clotted inside the heart. And the doctor actually tried to emphasize that she just suffered from tuberculosis. However, the villagers were not to be convinced, and they believed that they had found their vampire, so they burned her heart and liver on a nearby rock, and they fed Eddie, the ashes. But he still died less than 2 months later. Now, George, the father, did ask the doctor to perform an autopsy at the graveyard.
Okay, good.
And turns out George Brown was not on site during this exhumation of his family, of his entire family. He elected to be somewhere else. It later turned out that maybe George Brown was not so on board with this whole vampire theory, and instead simply did it to, quote, satisfy the neighbors. And in a way, you can kind of understand, because these locals, they were determined to find their vampire, and George had to live amongst them.
Yeah.
And he did. And he did, because he apparently was not prone to tuberculosis, and he lived into 1922, into a ripe old age.
That's a long life.
Yeah. So, just to talk a little bit about why people believe these things, I think it's an interesting concept that it can't have been an easy process digging up the bodies of your loved ones.
No
of
way.
Your children, your siblings, your spouses. But I think that it's worth kind of exploring, why would people do this? The human brain was not, our brain has not changed in the last couple hundred years. We're operating with the same brain that they had. So even though science and medicine has evolved, they were arguably of the same intelligence. And the 1800s were a period of social progress, and there was actually a lot of scientific advancements taking place. And Exeter was close to Newport, Rhode Island, which was really this high society destination. Industrialists would go there. So Exeter was, I think, 20 miles away, but it was a small community, but not too far from a relatively modern area. I think when you see this epidemic claiming 25% of people, of all the deaths in the Northeast, it does something to you. And so Mercy's mother, Mercy Lena Brown's mother, died in 1882, remember? And she later died in 1892. Well, in 1882, the other thing that happened was Robert Koch had actually, yes, funny name, Dr. Koch had identified the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882. So scientifically, they had identified tuberculosis in 1882, but the news of this discovery was relatively slow in spreading. Whereas the disease was spreading fast, the news of the discovery had spread slowly.
Yeah, they didn't have news channels like we do.
Right. And considered drug treatments for tuberculosis would not become available until the 1940s. And the medical community was basically doing bupkis, because they couldn't do anything. So the best they could do was say drinking tinctures of brown sugar dissolved in water might cure you, or frequent horseback riding might cure you of tuberculosis. And they were saying this just to say something, because otherwise their only thing they could say was, there's nothing we can do. And they didn't want to say that.
Yeah.
Although some people said, whatever, it's in God's hands. But the medical community couldn't really say anything. So I think that these townsfolk, these people in these rural areas, and they had these old belief systems, because again, and a lot of times the young was leaving the area, so that left the older population, an older vulnerable population, where superstitions continued to persist. I think they were just trying to do whatever they could do, and there was widespread belief in this, that it was the only guidance. It was sort of like these folklore provided an alternative to a helpless situation. And while these rural areas believed that, there were mainstream newspapers at the time that were saying, quote, "We seem to have been transported back to the darkest age of unreasoning ignorance and blind superstition instead of living in the 19th century," where the Boston Daily Globe said, quote, "Perhaps the frequent intermarriage of families in these backcountry districts may partially account for some of their characteristics," basically blaming
Yeah.
backwoods redneck
Yeah.
things. And really interestingly, and I think there's a parallel to our own pandemic situation in this country, is that the London Post, so stories of the Yankee vampire jump the pond was being reported on in Europe, and they said whatever is happening in America with this Yankee vampire, it's an American problem. And so the legacy of all of this is that Mercy Brown was supposedly the last American vampire. And her story may have inspired Bram Stoker when he was writing Dracula. And now this is contested. However, Bram Stoker, Dracula came out later, only a couple years after Mercy Brown's death. Bram Stoker's character of Lucy in Dracula is a young woman who is infected and exhumed as a physician looks on, and you consider the name Lucy does sound a little bit like
Lena.
a combination of Lena and Mercy. Also, H.P. Lovecraft, who is an icon and instrumental in horror, even though he was a garbage human being and a racist, seems to have been inspired by the Mercy Brown story in The Shunned House. And in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, in Exeter, Rhode Island, you can still go see the marker, the gravestone of Mercy Lena Brown. She lies beside the brother who ate her heart and next to the father who let it happen. And some say she continues to haunt a bridge in Exeter and even murmurs in the cemetery as a ghost. So some people that go to try to capture her voice continue to hear her. And sometimes she even visits the terminally ill to tell them that dying is not so bad.
Wow.
So it's a story of the New England vampire panic, even in a relatively modern, evolved era of American history. In rural areas, there was still this belief in vampires, and I'm going to throw it out here that perhaps for the mini-sode or at another time, I will give you the story from 1849 from Pennsylvania that suggests maybe, just maybe, the vampire panic did not end with Mercy Brown, but continued well into the 20th century.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So, with that said, this is just a crazy chapter of American history, and one that was talked about the world over and was happening. We're recording this in New York City. Was happening right around us, and even as far west as Minnesota.
Yeah. But, you have to think, like, even now, and not to get, like, too existential or whatever, but, like, you hear of these rural areas or areas where there is a heavily older community where they're not wearing masks, even though our media is, like, coming out saying, and studies clearly show that they're effective. Like, there's rural pockets where they aren't doing it and they have their own belief system. So, I mean, it's not as extreme as vampires, but I think the mentality isn't all that dissimilar.
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether or not you could say it is or isn't as extreme as vampires, because you consider that as we're recording this, if 200,000 people are dying in the United States alone of COVID-19, I think the parallel there, and is quite timely, is that now media is playing a different role now because people can very much operate in an echo chamber with their own confirmation bias and consume the media that just supports what they believe. However, we do live in a time where if you have some sort of belief system, or if you consume certain kinds of media, it will actually create a belief system for you that instead of a virus, instead of a disease ravaging us, when we have yet to establish a vaccine, rather we can find our own essential new folk beliefs to explain away what's happening, either as a hoax or demon alien DNA or other conspiracy theories that are out there. You can find your own folk beliefs to explain it away, and it allows you to grapple with a sometimes a unmanageable problem. Although it is manageable if we were just going to wear bloody masks and keep at a social distance.
Well, don't wear bloody masks. You should have them clean.
Yeah.
But wear a mask.
Don't wear bloody masks. Yeah. I guess unless you're a vampire and you just want a little snack inside your mask. So you can just lap it up like a little bit, like thinking Hannibal Lecter ate fava beans with a nice Chianti.
Oh my God, stop that. You know I hate that noise. I got my flu shot today. Trying to prevent that flu season, COVID, whatever.
Good. So
be safe.
Anyhow, well, before we get out of here, let's just throw out a little paranormal pop culture. What are you into this week?
So because we're getting into spooky season, I've actually discovered some really incredible spooky season playlists on Spotify. One I really love by Kayla Nicholson. That's a little more offbeat, but there's a lot of really good Halloween time playlists. So I'll link to that on the sources page on our Patreon. But I've just been jamming out to some good spooky tunes to get in the mood.
We could also, I actually have my own, the one I've cultivated, a Halloween playlist.
Good. Let's link that.
We could create a NightMerica Spotify playlist. We should work on that.
Send us your recommendations.
And I like that. I like that a lot. Well, I'm kind of in a similar mode. Definitely into all the spooky stuff. I'm always into the spooky stuff. Yeah. It's the job. It's actually, it's part of my life. What am I talking about? It's a 24/7 deal. But I do revisit certain Halloween-themed movies. So that's kind of what I've been doing. And I have to say, I've talked about the Shudder horror streaming service before, and I just want to give another shout-out to them. But to kick things off, I'm just going through and watching episodes of Creepshow, which is an anthology horror series, as well as the Creepshow movie, and so I'm getting into all of my Halloween rewatches right now, and I'll be talking about what Halloween themed movie I'm into each week as we go forward.
I love it.
This, So, okay. Well, we came in long with this, but I think that it was a bloody good time. I think we really sank our teeth into the topic.
Ew. And I'm so excited that next week will not be vampires.
Oh, did I not tell you? This is a 2-part episode. I actually did. I with all this research and all the vampire lore, I did think about we should talk about.
Oh my God, no.
2-part. Okay.
I can talk about girls being murdered all day long, but for some reason drinking blood just so creeps me out.
Well, at least you have standards, I guess. Well, okay, so then I guess we will not stake out more vampire stories.
Tune in the Patreon for
next
more.
Week. Yeah, check that out. Well, I'll continue with vampire puns on the Patreon minisode.
Yeah, and speaking of Patreon, we need to give a shout out to one of our newer $15 subscribers, Amy Birch. This is a little late coming, sorry, Amy. But thank you for being a supporter.
Thank you, Amy. We love you. We love all of our supporters and subscribers. Sure. And anyone just listening randomly.
You're
we like
great.
You too.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're at love yet, if you're just listening. But subscribe. And then we're getting to love. So, thanks for joining us for this kind of kickoff of the Halloween season. It's our first Halloween, Britt.
I know, this is exciting.
I mean, together as a podcast. I've had a few Halloweens already, but
you've had 800 Halloweens before this, but
yes, I am actually an 800-year-old vampire.
Yeah. If you like NightMerica, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/NightMerica and consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. Give us a follow on social media and share this with your friends.
And if you'd like to share your paranormal stories or even seek paranormal advice, which is for entertainment purposes only, email nightmericashow@gmail.com.